Hello, guys. I'm making this review and presentation about the book Story by Robert McKee. Okay, book about screenwriting. And I'm going to start by telling my personal opinion about the book and what I found about it, what is my opinion about it. Then I'm going to make a short summary covering every chapter of the book. And after that, I will make a longer and extensive analysis and going through all the points on the book. So we have a deeper insight about it. So, first of all, this is probably one of the best screenwriting books that I've ever come to so far. It really inspired me because, as the title says, it's mostly about story and the art and craft of story. So, as Robert McKee says, story is probably 75% or more of a screenwriter's job. And the reason I really like this book is because, as McKee says in the beginning, right in the beginning of the book, he writes the, the first the first things he writes, as you can see it here. Story, it's about principles and not about rules. So basically, my personal opinion is that this book really made me enter into the mood of why I want to be a screenwriter. So it makes you get the fundamentals and the basics and get you in the right mood about how to build a story. And as he says, it's not about rules. So in this book, McKee doesn't go too much into detail about this is how you have to create a character, A, B, C, D, this checklist, that checklist, do this, do that. He doesn't go on that. It's about you having a consciousness, what is needed for a great story. That's the main focus of this book. And as a beginner screenwriter, I think it's great to read it. It's great to read it. You have a really nice picture of what is your biggest work, your what is the essential of what you're doing. As a beginner screenwriter, I think this is very important because as I've read a couple of books now, maybe 10 regarding screenwriting, I know a lot of them go too much into details and very technical aspects of screenwriting. And sometimes for a beginner screenwriter, that might be sometimes a bit too much to take in. For example, I remember now John Truby in his book when he covers character web. He goes really, in my opinion, maybe I'm not able to understand it, but it's really detailed how you should build characters and the relationship that characters have to each other and how you should look at all that. But in my opinion, sometimes as a beginner screenwriter, that might get you a bit lost instead of give you an insight. It might be just too much information. And I found that McKee in this book, he really doesn't go too much into the technical part of screenwriting, but he stays on the basics and just tries to show you an idea. And that's why I found it really, really, really inspiring. I believe this book dates of 1998. So my take on that is that probably the industry, and when I say industry, I'm referring to screenwriting books industry. My personal opinion is that maybe, of course, there is so many books out there and so much theory. So maybe authors try to get more and more specific every time and go into really detailed things of screenwriting, and then they come with all these rules and things that you have to look at, and every author has like a certain approach to it, and all the steps. There are many books with kind of steps, and they list the steps of that you should work on in order to get your story going, or your character going, or your scene going. There is even books with a lot of steps just for one scene. And of course, all of that is precious information. But in my opinion, this is where everything starts. This is like McKee says, it's 75% or more of your job is to get the story right. And he explains here how that works, what is story and what story works. So, really good book. And as McKee says, story, it's about truthness, it's about real events that happens in our lives, but it's told with craft. It's well told. So story, it's about real events, real life events, but told in a special way that touches the audience. And actually, one of the things that I have an opinion about this book is I call it the difference between talent and technique. Talent and technique. So, in my opinion, as a screenwriter, you can have talent, which is something maybe talent is something that you are born with, but it's also something that you can work to improve your talent, to improve your craft. McKee refers to craft many times. So that's one thing. And the other thing is technique. So I believe that this book is about craft and about talent. It really inspired me in the sense of, okay, what is screenwriting about, and what is and why do you want to tell a story, and how do you tell a story? So this, in my opinion, is the part of talent and the part of craft. Then maybe other books, I believe they are more technical. Well, that's how I describe them. So technical, then it's going into like, okay, all these steps for you to get the perfect scene, or all the things that you need, or this huge checklist of things that you have to think about when you are designing your character. For me, those things are like technical things. So this is a great book for the general part of screenwriting, and then there are maybe other books that are more technical, more specific. But if you feel that all those books that you're reading are very technical and specific with a lot of information that you're not being able to put them all together at the moment, so I believe this one is really the one that will start to bring you in the mood of screenwriting. This book starts with a quick introduction with a few sentences and insights about what is screenwriting and what is story about. So that you have a little introduction, and then we go to a chapter called the story problem. The story problem, McKee refers to the fact that one of the problems about story nowadays is that there have been so many movies, so many stories out there, that the array of ideas, it's kind of a bit saturated. So it's really hard for screenwriters nowadays to kind of find originality. This is one of the problems. So the industry is growing. There is what he describes more of a mass consumption of entertainment, and therefore the need for stories. And within this mass consumption and growth of industry, the real craft of story created by real good screenwriters is a bit disappearing, or there is less space for it. And guys, after part one, where we have an introduction and the story problem, we have part two, which covers the elements of story. So now McKee starts going into more detail about what is a story and what makes a story. So In chapter 2, we have the structure spectrum. So, in this chapter, he goes through what is a scene, what is a beat, what is a sequence, acts, and how the stories are organized. By the way, he acknowledges that some authors they are against or in favor of the three act structure, and he says that a story can have more than three acts, but he accepts the three act structure as the common ground or the basics where you can start your story with. And the reasons why he says that, we will see them later when I go through a deeper analysis. But for now, this is the still in chapter 2, the structure spectrum. He talks about the archetype kind of story, which is, we can say, it's kind of the classic kind of story. Classic kind of story where you have the main protagonist, which is the more active figure, which in this story the time is linear. So he starts with an exciting incident. There are more and more complications, and then you get a big resolution in the climax. And usually the archetype story is a positive ending at the end. So this is kind of the basic main way of telling a story. And then he says there are other ways which he calls the mini plot story. And by mini plot, he says that some of the steps of the normal archetype story don't exist in the mini plot, and we have the anti plot story where rules from the archetype story are broken. Okay, we will go more in detail after into that. Then chapter 3 talks about structure and setting. Structure and setting basically is, McKee refers at how important it is the setting for the story. I know some of us sometimes tend to neglect the setting, just think like the character or the story is important, but it doesn't matter where it happens. But for McKee, it's really important that we locate. So to define a location for your story, it's important, and that will affect the structure of your story and the genre of your story, perhaps as well. Chapter 4, structure and genre. There we go again. Some words about the different genres, and he says that you need to master your genre in order to become a really good screenwriter. So he says over the years we have to find out what is our genre of writing, and we should stick to that. Chapter 5 debates structure and character. When he talks about character here, is just the importance of building a character for the overall story. So he doesn't go into really detail how you should build a character, but he's just talking about the importance of the character in the structure of the story. Always the protagonist is the most important character, of course, and he defines character and characterization as well. Chapter 6, structure and meaning. Structure and meaning. So by meaning, McKee refers to finding the controlling idea of your story. What do you want to show with your story? Remember, story is about true events of life. So with true events of life, we want to show something about life to the audience. So that's the ultimate target, is to show something about life. So we need to find what is the controlling idea, what is the theme of our story, and that theme will affect structure as well. So structure and meaning. So now part 3 is the principles of story design. So now we go more into detail of how to design a story. We saw the elements of story. Now, how to design the story. Chapter number 7 is the substance of story, And this chapter basically covers a lot the protagonist and the journey of the protagonist along the story. So, how do we progress through story? And we progress through story with conflicts, which they can be inner conflicts, personal conflicts, or conflicts with the society. And also, McKee refers all the time about the gap between expectation and final result. So as we progress in the story, characters they always expect something. They go into a scene expecting something, and then something else happens. So this is a gap between the expectation of the character and the end result of the action. So this gap is what provokes the story to keep going and the conflicts that he has with himself, with people around him, or with society. Then, chapter 8, the inciting incident. You already all know what is the inciting incident. Is the event that throws the main character into the journey that he's going to go through. So all the details about inciting incident, very interesting as well. Chapter 9, it's about act design. Act design basically covers the how the story progresses within the acts of the plot. So from the inciting incident to the midpoint and so on. McKee refers that story is divided into five main parts, which he describes as inciting incident, uh, com- uh, further complications, crisis, climax, and resolution. These are the five points for McKee that a story is made of. We will go deeper into that as well later on, but this is in this chapter he covers act design. After that, we have chapter 10 about scene design. And in scene design, he covers things like the progression and transition from one scene to another, and what I've referred before, the positive and negative values within the scenes and within the actions. So he covers how basically how we design uh, the plot that goes from one scene to another. Those are the points focused in this chapter. Then we have a chapter 11. Chapter 11 is about scene analysis, and he explains a few things that in his opinion we need in order to properly build a scene, but he also explains how to analyze a scene. And we are in by scene analysis, it's about turning point, it's about the actions of the characters within the scene. So it's about when we enter the scene, to analyze what kind of expectations the characters have, what is the value at risk, what is the charge of the value, if it's negative or positive in the scene, how is it in the beginning of the scene and at the end of the scene, and what are the turning points of the scene. So basically that's how we make a scene analysis. Number 12, it's described as composition. It's about composition, and by composition he means he compares composition of a plot like composition of music, so the elements that we need in order to compose. And basically he explains about how to put scenes together, the elements that we need to put one scene after the other. This is what he refers as composition. Next chapter, it's chapter 13, and chapter 13 is about crisis, climax, and resolution, what I've referred already. And here he goes more into detail about these end parts of the story. Just a little note from my perspective for McKee, climax, it's probably the most important part of your story. It's almost like what is the story completely about. And he makes this example that you can have a really good movie with really good setup, with amazing, exciting incident, amazing characters, and everything goes really well. But if you blow it on the climax, you arrive at the climax and nothing is happening, or you don't give anything to the audience, the movie's gonna be a flop. On the other hand, you can have a really bad movie, nothing is happening, inciting incident is really trivial, your characters are flat, nothing is really happening for most of the movie, maybe 70 minutes. And then you arrive to the end and you have a really good climax. And that movie actually is going to give more satisfaction to an audience than the first example. So that's the example he gives to show that how important climax is. And he actually says that your story should be built around climax. And first you should find what is the climax of your story, and only then you will gonna find what is the exciting incident of the story, which he considers to be the second most important point of the story, which kicks off and has to grab the audience attention. So climax, the most important thing, inciting incident, second most important thing. Keep those in mind. Um, okay, that was all about the part three. So remember, part two covered the elements of story. Part three, the principles of story design. Principles of story design. The last part of the book is part number four, and part number four, it's described as the writers at work. Chapter 14, we have the principle of antagonism. So McKee says that a story can only be as good as the forces of antagonism are. So forces of antagonism are the ones who move the story forward and move your protagonist forward. So very important. Chapter 4 is all about the principle of antagonism. Chapter 15 is about exposition. Exposition is about the information that we need to give into the story, but of course it's usually very boring for the audience, so you should try to show, not tell. Basically, this is the main idea that McKee shows, is like try to show and not tell exposition. There are ways of doing that. Chapter 16, it's called problems and solutions. McKee goes through some problems that may arise in our stories and how to solve them. Chapter 17 is about character. And here the main idea is that he says we really need to be an insider of our character. We need to know our character better than anyone else, and we need to make it authentic and original. Cliche is something that Robert McKee really doesn't like. And as I said in the beginning, in his introduction, he talks about this growth of the industry and more entertainment material, which he considers to be most of it loaded with cliche stuff. And if we want to stay out of cliche, we really need to put effort into being authentic. And in order to be authentic, we need to put ourselves in the positions of our characters. Chapter 18 about text, mostly about dialogue and description. A few words how dialogue should be and description should be. And chapter 19, the last chapter of the book, it's about a writer's method. So, how a skillful screenwriter should prepare his story. He makes an example. He says beginner screenwriters tend to write from the outside in. This is how McKee describes it, and he refers to many of us. We have a great idea, we picture some scenes, and then we try to noodle a bit about it, try to create a story that is going to use those scenes. So we rush to the computer and we start writing our script, and this actually we fail to create story because he says story is about turning points, it's about plot points, and we are too blind in these scenes that we have in our head, and we are trying to build a story around these scenes, whereas the skillful and truthful screenwriter writes from inside out. Once he has the idea, he tries to get deep into the character and he tries to think what is the message of the story he wants to tell, and he starts to think how is he going to deliver that message with the climax. And from the climax he works backwards to the inciting incident and discover the main turning points of the story. And after that he works on the step outline without a big description of the scenes, but the step outline is just to compose this conflict and charges that goes through the plot points and through the climax. So this is how a skillful screenwriter should work, in his opinion. And I think many of us have been in these screenwriting course. We learn a lot from the step outline, and McKee reinforces how important the step outline is and how we should have a really prepared step outline, which we're going to spend most of our time on creating a story. We should spend it on the step outline. And only when we have a really solid step outline, we then move into writing, which should be the lesser of the work. So this is about the last chapter. And then we have a fade out of the book with a really nice story that McKee said his father used to tell him. And I would like to read it to you because it's really interesting. And the story goes like this. High above the forest floor, a millpid strolled along the branch of a tree. Millpid is that animal that has a lot of members, like millions of members. In case you don't know, millpid, I don't know if I'm reading this right, but okay. Her thousand pairs of legs swinging in an easy gait. From the treetop, songbirds looked down, fascinated by the synchronization of the millpad's stride. That's an amazing talent, chirped the songbirds. You have more limbs than we can count. How do you do it? And for the first time in her life, the millpid thought about this. Yes, she wondered. How do I do? As she turned to look back, her bristling legs suddenly ran into another, entangled like vines of ivy. The songbird laughed as the millpad, in a panic of confusion, twisted herself into a knot and fell to the earth below. And then McKee goes to describe, you too may sense this panic. I know that when confronted with a rush of insight, even the most experienced writers can be knocked off stride. Okay? Fortunately, my father's fable had an act too. So basically, I found that this is a really nice metaphor to show how maybe we feel. I felt like that many times before. We get so much information, then suddenly we are like, okay, I cannot write absolutely anything because with when I start thinking about all this checklist, all these steps to do anything, all these rules of screenwriting, all this information that we get, it would drive us crazy. So that's what happened to the millpad, right? This is how we might feel sometimes. But then the story goes into Act Two, and Act Two goes like this. On the forest floor, the millpid, realizing that only her pride was hurt, slowly, carefully, limb by limb, unraveled herself. With patience and hard work, she studied and flexed and tested her appendages until she was able to stand and walk. What was once instinct became knowledge. She realized she didn't have to move at her old, slow rate pace. She could amble, strut, prance, even run and jump. Then, as never before, She listened to the symphony of the songbirds and let music touch her heart. Now, in perfect command of thousands of talented legs, she gathered courage and, with a style of her own, danced and danced a dazzling dance that astonished all the creatures of her world. So, what the story wants to say by this is although we might feel a bit overwhelmed sometimes with all this technical information, although I said that in my opinion, this book is not that technical as many other books are. This book really gives you an insight, and when you read it, you feel kind of more inspired and kind of it makes you sense like, aha, this is how I should think in order to create my story. So he's not giving you too much information of what you have to do and what you don't have to do. It's not that technical as a book. But this story at the end really made me feel like sometimes we get all this information and we might feel a bit kind of overwhelmed by it. But once we let that information settle and we assimilate it, then that information becomes part of our writing. It becomes instinct and we can let it flow again. And like the meal pit, we will be better writers than before. And McKee says that as well. There McKee says there might be out there writers that have a really amazing talent for story. And in that talent, out of that talent, maybe one or two amazing stories come out. But he says those writers will never know why they created those amazing stories. They just did it out of talent. They will never know the real craft. But when asked, what those writers, when asked to have a more professional work in which they have to work on a more consistent level and produce things more regularly, they usually fail because they don't really know what they are doing. So a professional writer should have all this information to assimilate, create a method of working, and that's how we improve ourselves basically. So very good, really recommend it. There are many other things that I couldn't say in so short time, but really really insightful. So I will try to now make I'll try to be quick, otherwise it's going to last forever. But I'll try to go more in deep into every chapter of this book and analyze these few things that McKee says in there. So let's go back to the introduction, as I try to show you here. In this book, there are always parts which are marked like this in black. So throughout the book, there is always these parts in black which really summarizes almost the whole page and get the main idea. So it's really nice to read, and you can always go back and see this summary and remember what it's all about. But the introduction, I will read a few of these. Introduction, it's McKee saying, story is about principle, not rules. Story is about eternal universal forms, not formulas. Story is about mastering the art and not second guessing the marketplace. So basically, what he's trying to say here is that we shouldn't try to follow trends or say like, okay, now it's very trend this kind of movie, so I'll try to write one myself. We need to really master the craft and, like he said before, find our own genre as well. Story is about respect, not disdain for the audience. So respecting the audience means really working on your craft to give the audience something worthful. The audience is going to be there 2 hours watching your movie because they want to take something precious home. They want you to tell a worthful story, a story worth listening to, it full of emotions and with a truthfulness on it. And and by respecting the audience, he feels like not just using like cheap tricks to just make a story run just by the sake of running. That's not respecting the audience in McKee's point of view. Okay. Story is about originality, not duplication. Again, we can only be original if we are authentic and if we do our research and write about things we know and put time and dedication and craft in order to develop that. If we try to just throw things if we have like a great idea for a scene and the rest of the story, like characters and the rest of the story are just there to fill the gap between the scenes that we have and the whole 100 pages that we need to write, then of course that story is going to be full of cliches and things that are not really authentic. Makes sense, right? The story problem. Then, chapter number one, story problem, the decline of story, which I said already. The whole the evolution of the industry in the point of view of McKee, and there is just too much entertainment nowadays, and there is a lack actually of really deep and meaningful and craftful stories nowadays. He goes through it. Loss of craft, again, as mentioned before. So, good story, well told. I'm reading like the main within the every chapter is divided by different topics. I'm now reading the topics and trying to give you a few words about it. Good story, well told. This is our goal. McKee says that it's not enough to have a good story. Even if we think of a really good story, it needs to be told well. This is the main idea. Even if we have a message to tell to our audience, a really good message, we cannot just get there and say it, because this is not what story is about. Story is about the journey of emotions, conflicts, complications, progression until you get to the end result. This is how the audience feels fully satisfied. You have to create this journey of emotions to tell then the final, the climax, the idea that you want to tell. So that's why he calls this section good story, well told. This is about screenwriting. It's not just the story, but it's the way you say it. Okay, craft maximizes talent. Again, the same story. He says that many screenwriters nowadays, also because it's easy nowadays, it's so easy to find information online and just like how to write a script. You start by this and that, and then it's very easy for any person nowadays just to have an idea and go and write a script if they want, right? Because there is so much information about screenwriting. There is so many programs about writing scripts, and there is so many people nowadays that they just have an idea, they want to tell it, and they just rush to the computer. But he's saying craft maximizes talent. He defends that a screenwriter should really do its work, should really learn the craft first before you start doing your work. And the more you do this, the more you can improve your talent. Part 2, the elements of story. Chapter 2, the structure spectrum. Okay, the terminology of story. I will read you some of these parts in black. There are some of them are really condensed and interesting information. The life story of each and every character offers encyclopedic possibilities. The mark of a master is to select only a few moments but give us a lifetime. So basically, here again, McKee is saying that, of course, when we create a character, we need to go deep into the character. We need to know the character life and backstory, and that life and backstory from every character could actually open a million of possibilities for us to write about this character. But our work is just to select those very important moments of the life of that character, those very short moments that we're going to actually show on screen. And with those very short moments, we create a lifetime to the audience. The audience is going to go home knowing this character inside out. So this is what we have to do. Okay. This chapter goes through structure. He says structure is a selection of events from the character's life stories that is composed into a strategic sequence to arouse specific emotions and to express a specific view of life. So, again, the same thing. It's about selecting the specific happenings of this character's life. And with those little moments that we're going to show on screen, we compose it and we create the structure for our story. Okay, he goes on to describe this chapter is about the structure, so he goes on and describe what is structure, what is an event, what is a story event. A story event creates meaningful changes in the life situation of a character that is expressed and experienced in terms of value. As I said before, positive value or negative value. This is an event. Okay. Story values are the universal qualities of human experience that may shift from positive to negative. Again, a story event creates meaningful change in the life situation of a character that is expressed and experienced in terms of a value and achieved through conflict. So events are achieved through conflict. Conflict is one of the factors that drives story. Okay, when we are writing, a story can only progress through conflict or exposition. In exposition, we are explaining things. When there is conflict, the story is actually progressing forward. And when there is conflict, there is a gap between expectation and end result, and that gap creates the event of a character. And that event can be positively charged or negatively charged. Where the positive are the positive feelings of life, love, friendship, happiness, excitement, so on. And negative events are the negative things in life, sadness, depression, pain, and so on. Okay, he goes on to describe what is a scene. A scene is an action through conflict in more or less continuous time and space that turns the value charge conditions of a character life on at least one value with a degree of perceptible significance. Ideally, every scene is a story event. Okay, so basically, this is a scene. Here we are going a bit more into detail, but a scene is an action where there is an event for the character, and that event there is a transformation of the value charge that is perceptible significance of this event. I don't know if this was clear for everybody. But basically, in a scene, there is an event, and out of this event, there is some emotional charge, emotional value charge. So, in one scene, a character can enter the scene with a positive charge and end the scene with a negative charge. Okay, a breakup scene between a couple. In the beginning, they are all right. At the end of the scene, they broke up, so they are not all right. So usually scenes go from one value to the other value, from positive to negative, or from negative to positive, or they go from positive to more positive, or from negative to more negative. Then McKee goes on to describe what is a beat. And a beat is an exchange of behavior in action reaction. Bit by bit, this changing behavior shape the turning of a scene. So a beat is just something smaller than a scene. A beat is every action. A character makes an action, the other character responds with another action, and so on. He goes on to describe what is a sequence. A sequence is a series of scenes, generally 2 to 5, that culminates with a greater impact than any previous scene. Okay, so a sequence, it's a group of scenes in where the final effect is just bigger of any one of those scenes. He goes on to describe what is an act. Act is a series of sequences that peak in climatic scenes, which causes a major reversal of values, more powerful in its impact than any previous sequence or scene. Okay, now I jumped a little bit. I will not cover every single heading that it's inside every chapter, because otherwise it's going to be too long. I will go through the ones that, in my opinion, were more insightful and more important. So now we are still on the second chapter, structure, the structure spectrum of story. And McKee talks about arch plot, mini plot, and anti plot. Okay, and here we have this triangle here. This is the arch plot. Here we have anti plot and mini plot. And I think, as I explained before, arch plot is basically the main way how a story should be told. And as I can read here, in an arch plot with, or what McKee calls the classic design, he calls it also the classic design. And I will read what he says. Classic design means a story built around an active protagonist who struggles against primarily external forces of antagonism to pursue his or her desire through continuous time within a consistent and casually connected fictional reality to a closed ending of absolute irreversible change. Okay? So basically, the classic design of story, in McKee's opinion, has a closed ending, linear time, external conflict, single protagonist, consistent reality, and an active protagonist. So the protagonist is the active part. Then there are two other ways of telling story, in his opinion, which go out of the classic design, which is the mini plot. And mini plot, it's the same like the classic, but without some of these points. So a mini plot can have an opening ending, which the classic design doesn't have an opening ending. The ending must be clear. The mini plot can have internal conflicts. So the classic design is about conflicts with exterior forces, not interior. The mini plot can have multi protagonists, and the main protagonist can be passive. So instead of being the one who takes action and go through, things can happen to him. So this is called the mini plot. And the other variant is the anti plot. And the anti plot is about breaking rules from the classic model. So the anti plot, you can have coincidence, you can have non-linear time, and you can have inconsistent reality. So if you're writing a story about anti-plot, anti-plot is really about breaking the rules. It's like McKee said, reality has to be consistent. When you create a world, everything needs to make sense in that world. Whereas in an anti-plot, the world can change, for example, in the middle of the movie. Okay, so these are the three ways that he explains how stories can be, but he says the most important one is the classic design. And even if you're writing an anti-plot or a mini plot, he says you have to master the classic design rules, because only mastering those you can do something that it's against. Only mastering the rules you can break them. Okay? Because if you break the rules just by chance, just by doing whatever you want, then you're not going to have a good story. Basically, that's it. But if you know the rules and you know how to break them, you might end up with a really good story anyway. Very good. Then, still in this chapter, she goes on to differences within the story triangle. Story triangle is this triangle that I showed you: classic design, mini plot, anti plot. So he talks about closed versus open endings. Very interesting insight. He talks about external versus internal conflict. Interesting as well. Single versus multiple protagonists. Okay, how to work with one protagonist or with multiple protagonists. Active versus passive protagonists. And linear versus non-linear time. Casuality versus coincidence. This is a very important point if you're using coincidence. McKee says you can use coincidence, but coincidence needs, you have to use it, you have to have time to justify the coincidence. If you just use coincidence out of nothing, then it's kind of cheating the audience, right? So you can use coincidence in a story like, I don't know, the protagonist was in a bar and then by coincidence a person comes and talks to him, like out of nowhere for no reason. But then you need to use that person or explain somehow why that person arrived there. Because if you have just a person arriving out of coincidence, delivering something that the protagonist wants, and then that person disappears forever and you never see her again, then it's like, yeah, okay, it's kind of, it's too easy. Like, why would that happen? Just the person just arrived because it needed to do that. So this is how he describes that you can use coincidence, but you need to be careful with coincidence. Whereas story progresses with casuality. Okay, the a character did something that caused something else to go and do something else. So there is a casuality always, something that makes sense. When you use coincidence, then you need to allow enough time to justify that coincidence. And the worst you can do, as he explains, is to use coincidence near the end of the story or on the climax. So if you have a climax based on coincidence, then you might guess already that it's not really going to work. Still in this character, we have the politics of story design. He talks a bit about Hollywood cinema against art cinema, or he says most of art cinema comes from Europe, so European cinema, and how sometimes the definitions that, or the idea that we have about these two types of cinema kind of limit our work as a writer. So maybe art cinema, they put too much attention into details of, or details of 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 the scenes and cinematography or photography, and they maybe therefore forget the story or the plot. And if you are making a Hollywood movie, then maybe you focus too much into the need of action, the need of explosive scenes, and and basically he says that all these political exterior distractions makes the story suffer, which the story should be the essential of screenwriting. So he goes a bit into political politics of story design in this chapter, and then he needs to say a few words about what a screenwriter should do. He says a screenwriter should live from writing. We all would love that, of course. If we get to that point, that's good news. Live from writing, because, of course, many try maybe to go to California. You work in a restaurant while you write, but you might get to a point of saturation, and you're not putting really your all energy into screenwriting. So if you have the possibility of getting a job, at least that you read scripts or that you write, that would be great. I don't know how many of us have that possibility, but he says that what you should be doing. A writer should be writing. Very good. The writer must master the classical form of story, as I said before. The writer must believe in what he writes. Great, and then we arrive to chapter number 3, structure and setting. Structure and setting. McKee goes on to talk on the war on cliche, how we have to fight cliche and why cliche happens. I think I had a few words on that already. Structure and setting, but this main chapter is about setting. So he goes on talking about setting, how important it is to set a story, and the setting is four-dimensional. When we set a story, there is the period of the story in time, period in time, the duration of the story. Story can last from 24 hours to 100 years. Location of the story, where it happens, very important, and level of conflict. By level of conflict, he refers to which level of conflict, if it's only in sorry, I'm having a blackout. If it's only internal conflict, if it's personal conflict, or if it's conflict with society. So this is also a setting, in his opinion, because of course, if we're making a movie about a conflict with society, then the setting includes the whole society. Whereas if we're making a movie about some inner conflict of some character, then the movie is just probably that character and his daily actions or whatever he goes through. So that's part of setting as well. And of course the relationship between setting and structure. He talks about the principle of creative limitation. So he says actually it's actually better for you the more you limit your setting, the more you define your location, the more you define your period in time, the duration, and conflict. The more definition you have, the more specific and more original your story can be. So this is what he wants to say by the principle of creative limitation. He actually says the more you limit, the more limitations you have, the more creative you need to be within those limitations. It makes some sense in a way, right? The importance of research. So once you made those limitations, you need to master what you're writing about. So you need to research, but you use also your own memory, the memory of your life events. We are writing always about life. So our life events, it's a great source of inspiration for what we are writing. Our imagination, of course, it's another factor, but and then the facts. So facts, it's what it's reality. Facts, we can find them in books, on things that are written or things that are studied. So this, it's part of the research, of course. So if you want to write about babies, then maybe you should go and do some research and read some books about babies and check some facts about them as well. Very good. Then we can move to the next chapter. Chapter 4 is about structure and genre. And so this chapter is all about genre, the film genre. And this is one of those examples that I said it gets a bit too technical, because in this chapter, McKee is listing he's listing 25 different genres of films, and by every genre he's listing on average 3 or 4 subcategories of that genre. So it's almost impossible to go through all of them and try to remember. But so as a beginner, of course, this is maybe too much, but I think one, if we continue into screenwriting, then once we discover our genre, and this is something that he says, we should discover which is the genre that we write the best, and we should master that genre. So once you discover your genre, then it might be interesting to understand all the subcategories of that genre and what are you really good at. But to have a look at all of the possibilities, it's a bit too much. Then he goes on to talk about relationship between structure and genre. Why does every kind of genre changes the structure of the story? I think it's quite logic.